What's up guys, Matt from Red Paw here, and today let's do a video to show you a gear breakdown that I use to make my own gear and gear for you. So today I'm going to discuss a lot of the products that I use for making gear and how you can get them too. These are just my recommendations of what I've used and what I've liked. So I'm going to have Amazon affiliate links. Total disclaimer, you can purchase items through the affiliate links and support the channel and the company. I really appreciate it if you do that, but obviously it's not necessary. This is just a recommendation, so you can go for variations of these different tools and you'll have absolutely no problems when you're making your gear. This video isn't about sewing machines, but obviously you're going to need one, so I recommend you look into that a little further and find the right machine that's going to suit your use. This is my machine, and it's a walking foot Juki machine. Highly recommended for heavier duty materials. But again, maybe we'll cover that in another video. Having light in your workspace is really important, so I recommend some LED strip lights. Again, link in bio to show you. And then additionally, I also recommend having a little magnetic lamp on the top of your sewing machine. A lot of the time they'll come with this, but it's really an important tool to have so that you know what you're working on when you're sewing it. One of the most important tools that you're going to use while you're sewing is a thread snip. I've had a couple different variations of these, all made from Fiskars, and this is the one that I recommend. It has a locking mechanism so that when you have to travel with it, you can close it, cover the blade. But this is the tool that I use most often, and I think that you will too. Whether you're making small cuts in the fabric or you're just snipping the threads while you're cutting and sewing, this is a very important tool to have. Your second most used tool is going to be your scissors or your shears. So I've had a lot of scissors over the years, and what I've found is it doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive pair for it to work well. What you're going to need is something that'll just do the job. It doesn't have to be very expensive, and in fact, my first pair of scissors was just from Walmart, very cheap, titanium, Westcott shears. Picking the right pair of scissors is really important when you're making your own gear, but it doesn't have to be expensive. This is one of those things that you don't have to spend a fortune on and get a good usable item. So scissors are the second most used tool, and this is just a cheap pair from Walmart, and they're one of my favorites. I've had this since the start and they work really well. After working with that first pair for a long time, I decided to upgrade and get this pair of Ginger shears. They're typically made for tailors and for clothes making, and they work pretty well. I use them as a fabric only shears. The only problem I had with them was resharpening, which is really important when you're using the scissors all the time. And then that comes to my most recent pair of scissors that I got in orange, of course. And these are very sharp. Also Fiskars and titanium. Really like the handle on these, and they're just the right length with a needle point. Highly recommended. Another really important step of making gear is marking the fabric. So you can use Sharpies and permanent markers, but obviously they're permanent. So that's not always the ideal solution. What I end up doing for marking, then cutting, or simply just marking for measurement purposes, etc., I use chalk. So I'll typically use a regular tailor's chalk. This is a really beat up piece of chalk. I mean, this is about to be thrown away, honestly, but you'll see they come in triangle shapes, and these are really useful and they last a very long time. You just sharpen it over time and keep reusing it. Okay, so then this is called a Choco liner, and this is really cool. This marks onto the stuff that sometimes the regular chalk like I just showed you won't, and I highly recommend it too. These are refillable, and this also has lasted quite a long time, and I haven't had to refill it yet. Third option for marking is a chalk pencil. So these are really good if you need a precision mark, and of course it has an eraser, and it's very easy to sharpen. The others are, the regular tailor chalk is okay to sharpen, but this is definitely the easiest. I find that the fine point definitely goes dull faster than the tailor's chalk, so take that for what it's worth, but I also like using these chalk pencils too. So to go along with marking your fabric for cutting or just measuring for placing things on the fabric, you need a good ruler. And so this is just a cheap little Westcott brand ruler. I recommend these too. I've got rulers all over the place. Wood, aluminum. This has a cork back so it doesn't slide on the fabric. And if you're actually using this to cut, then it actually stays on the fabric pretty well and doesn't slide too much, which would be awful if you cut your cut incorrectly. So I recommend checking these out. The cork backing, it's pretty good. And having the metal on the front is really important for if you're using a razor knife to cut your fabric with. So you want to mark your fabric, and sometimes you want to cut with a very big ruler. So I recommend a framing square. This is a starrette framing square. It's about 24 inches by about 16 inches. And I found this is just about the right size. I use this a ton when I'm starting to do patterning or I'm trying to make a long straight cut. Of course, that's under 2 foot long with the razor knife. And I'll just place this on top of the fabric, on top of the cutting mat, take my knife and then just cut along this edge. Of course, holding down onto the ruler so that it doesn't move in the process. Speaking of cutting mats, it doesn't really matter what you get. It's more important to get something appropriate for the size of your workspace. So I've got 2 3-foot by 4-foot tables, and this is the first one that I started out with when I was just working in my living room. This is about enough. That being said, you can always upgrade to a larger size, and I've gone to a 3-foot by 4-foot size for when I'm making the bigger cuts for backpack making. If you're making a project that has really long pieces, like maybe you're making a sil nylon tarp or something of that nature, maybe a quilt, it's really smart to have some really long measuring devices. So simple measuring tape, super cheap, obviously reliable. Another one is the retractable measuring tape. Also a good idea. I don't use those as often because I'm generally working on smaller projects, but I do recommend using one of these tools if you're making something like a tarp or a quilt. This is another fun tool if you're making those long cuts like I was just talking about. This is called a safety ruler. This is a big ruler, and what you do is you just place it down flush on the table, and this acts as a finger guard so that while you're running your razor knife along the edge, it'll protect you, and it also weights down the fabric quite well too. So I'd recommend one of these if you find yourself doing long cuts. This mostly sits in the corner for me. I don't use this that often. Another basic tool you might want is just a yardstick. You can get these anywhere for very cheap, and definitely a versatile tool, so I recommend having one. All right, so you got to the point where you need to cut your fabric. So what do you use? Well, I'll tell you this, it definitely depends on the material that you're using. But for me recently, and since I've been working with dynamic composite fabric and X-Pack, it has really become more of a razor knife chore for me. So when I do that, there's a couple variations. This is just a cheap little razor knife that you can get at any department store. This is my preferred razor knife. This is the X-Acto knife, and this is the same as the other, but it's just smaller and it's more the size of a pencil. So while you're using it, you can kind of get a better grip on it, and you can make curved cuts or you can just make more precise cuts with these. So you just pop a blade out when it gets dull and keep going. So that's the advantage of these, and they're pretty cheap too, so I recommend that. Now after that, if you want to keep going down the rabbit hole for razor knives, of course, you know, that last one was X-Acto brand, and this is too. This is the same kind of thing. This is more of a stylus type, so this has a craft blade on it, and it's very precise. I don't necessarily find this to be the most useful for cutting these fabrics because I find that I want a more broad blade edge. So that's why I really use the other one instead of this, but this is also really useful for detailed work. Now after that, this is actually a wood carving X-Acto blade, but it works pretty good, and it's the same as the other. You know, it's very small, so you can hold on to it and do detailed cuts. So I recommend checking out all these tools. You know, links down below to see and what you like best. But my preference is by far the Snap Away small X-Acto blade knife. I find this is my most commonly used blade tool for cutting fabric, and I'm cutting fabric quite a bit nowadays. I don't do a ton of work with really slippery fabrics, but I do a lot of work with stretchy fabrics. So if you've seen the stretchy top pocket on the Flex fanny packs, then you know that I use a lot of Spandura mesh. And it's hardly a mesh because it's really opaque, but it's quite stretchy, and that can be a burden to work with sometimes. So when you're cutting it, I highly recommend a Rotary tool. Again, this is a Fiskars brand Rotary tool, and this works really well because when you're cutting the fabric with a razor knife and it's moving around on you, you know that you're not going to get the cut that you really need. It won't be straight. So having a tool like this where you can just easily press down and just hold and push, it is much easier to get the mechanical advantage and cut the fabric that you need to cut without making more mistakes than you have to. One of my most used items when I'm sewing is these little clips. And these little clips are cheap and a dime a dozen, but they're so useful because when you're using laminated fabric, you can't use pins because pins will eventually make holes in the fabric that will never heal. So I really recommend using these clips. I think that they're really irreplaceable. All right, so you're in the middle of your sewing project and you just made a bad stitch. You just did something wrong. You know, it happens. It happens to me, it happens to everybody. So the next most important tool, the seam ripper. Having a good seam ripper is important. And honestly, they're pretty much disposable. I've broken a few of them, so they don't have to be the world's most expensive to be usable. This is probably only $2, $3, but definitely get one of these if you don't already. And it'd be shocking if you didn't already. In the same vein of making sure that your stitches are correct, it's really good to have a tool to navigate the fabric so that when it's going under the machine, your fingers aren't going next to the foot. So I have a walking foot machine, so it's pretty scary to get too close to the machine. You know, of course, the foot itself can hurt your fingers, but the needle is what really scares me. So in order to avoid that, I use some tweezers like this. This actually came with something, so I'll link something similar in the description below, but having tweezers like this is really important to just grip onto the fabric and just guide it where you want it to go. And so if you're doing something complicated like a zipper assembly or something that really just has a lot of layers and you need to make sure that that last eighth of an inch goes under the foot and hits the needle without your fingers getting caught in the way, tweezers are highly recommended. It's really important to seal the edges of your work after you're done sewing with some sort of heat or some sort of tape so that you make sure that your fabric won't fray and eventually tear. So most people, myself included, will just use a simple lighter. You know, that's all you really need. If you're trying to get into this on a budget, just use a Bic lighter. Don't even think about it. However, if you're getting more serious about it, I recommend a jet lighter. Jet lighters are more directional. So while you're using it, you can see the flame. It's kind of a straight line as opposed to a regular Bic lighter flame. This gives you a little more control over the melting of the fabric and kind of just puts you behind the driver's seat while you're trying to seal the edges. This lighter itself also does the regular Bic flame style, and the other advantage of this is you can just hold it far away from you, so there's less risk of burning yourself or the material. You can just kind of grip onto something where you probably couldn't have before with just the Bic lighter. Another big benefit of using these refillable jet lighters is that they're refillable, so you can just buy the butane can, and these lighters themselves aren't very expensive. So you buy the butane can, you buy one of these, and it's going to last you forever. So highly recommended to use a butane torch lighter. If you're just a first-time DIYer, this probably isn't a recommendation that you need. However, if you're getting serious about making your own gear, then you've realized that when you're burning these materials, it's possible that you're getting caustic chemicals and soaking them up into your lungs. So I recommend getting a charcoal filter of some sort. So when I use the jet torch and I melt webbing or the edges of fabric, whatever it might be, I know that I need those caustic fumes soaked up into these charcoal filters. So I'll link this one below. I recommend it. If you're getting serious about making your own patterns and making your own packs, you need to start making them on reusable pattern paper. So this is basically just manila folder paper. It's that same thickness of a manila folder onto a 48-inch roll. So this is what I recommend and what I've been using pretty frequently. You know, once you start making a pattern that you need to replicate pretty often, you can do so by putting that pattern onto another piece of material, maybe like a wood or a metal or plastic sheeting. But if you're making something just for 1 to 2 dozen uses, you know, I highly recommend just using this simple manila pattern paper. If you're getting into drafting your own patterns, there's a couple things you could use, but don't necessarily need. You know, what's really required to draft your own pattern is just the pencil and the paper that you're putting it on. So that being said, you can get a little fancy with it. You can use fine point Sharpies, you can just use a regular pen, you can even use a compass tool. You know, it doesn't really matter. You'll kind of find over the course of you learning how to pattern and doing it a few times what you need and what you don't need. Sometimes a lot of these accessories just aren't necessary. An extra useful little tool that I've just discovered recently is just a can of compressed air. You know, so your sewing machine will eventually collect dust and debris and thread and it just gets gross, and sometimes your tools do too. So just having one of these and just shooting a little compressed air over your workspace, inside the machine, wherever is really useful, and they're pretty inexpensive too. All right, so maybe you have to punch a couple holes into your fabric. So one thing that I do really frequently is make grommets. And the thing I discovered recently is just a grommet hole punch. For some reason, I didn't know that existed and was doing something that was way too complicated to make the hole in grosgrain or in fabric. So I discovered this punch, and it's really useful and pretty cheap too. So you just put your piece of fabric in here and press down until it clicks, holes created, and it's very simple. So I recommend that. Now, speaking of grommets, this is my grommet machine. This is a real cheap little thing that I bought on Amazon. It's just a little kit that comes with about 3-4 different sizes, and I found it to work pretty well. You know, you get what you pay for, which was about 60 bucks, 70 bucks, and it's pretty good. It's cast iron. You can see it's got a good solid motion to it. You don't need to even press very hard when you're using it, but it makes pretty clean grommets, and it's a lot better than using one of those hammer tool kits, which I was doing for the longest time. All right, so that's all for this one. Just a quick video to show you some of the accessories and tools that I use to make gear for the company and what I've found to be pretty useful and what works. You know, you don't need to spend a lot of money to get started, and you don't necessarily need all these tools. You know, I have a lot of tools, but I've collected them over the past 2-3 years, and I've just kind of found uses for them. So you don't need to get this advanced. If you're just starting your first project, you know, maybe pick up a couple things like the thread snips, the scissors, but beyond a couple of those items, like, you're good to go. You really don't have to worry about the advanced stuff like the charcoal filter or the jet lighter or the grommet press. It's not necessary for you. However, those tools are fun, and if you're looking for a professional result, these tools can help you get to that. Thanks for watching. Again, Matt from Red Paw. Appreciate all the support, everyone, and hope you like these kind of videos because I'll be making more of them. Peace.